All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening for those of you who are joining us from Jakarta and India, and good morning for those of you who are joining us from the United States. My name is Aristio Darmawan. I'm a lecturer in international law at Universitas Indonesia and a research associate here at the Indonesian's National Institute of Aeronautics and Space. It gives me a great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you in this webinar on enhancing Indonesia's space diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, an international perspective. As we all knew, in the last decades, space has been a very important source for many countries. There has been so many important developments, such as the increasing role of private sectors and non-governmental entities in engaging in space activities. Therefore, it creates an opportunities in space economy as well as security concern, because the nature of space activities is involving a high cost, high risk, and high technology. Cooperation among states is very much important. In the last decade or so, there has been an increasing importance of the Indo-Pacific regions. A geopolitical concept that connects the Indian Oceans and the Pacific Oceans has become a main theater for a global geopolitical arena. Even though that the Indo-Pacific is a very much maritime-driven concept, it is very important to see the role of space diplomacy in the regions and what are the challenges and opportunities that we have, mainly in regards to this webinar is from the Indonesian's perspective. Today, we are very honored and delighted to have two distinguished scholars to talk about these issues. But before we jump to the main discussions, please let me invite Dr. Heru Triharyanto, the Director of the Center of Aerospace Policy Studies at the Indonesian's National Institute of Aeronautics and Space, to give his welcome remarks. Dr. Heru, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Mas Tio. Welcome, everyone. Good morning for those who are in United States. Good evening, and from Indonesia and India. And I'm sure there are some others from a few other countries that attend this webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Danielle Woods and Dr. Rajagopalan for attending our event. This is very honor for us that you would like to come to our, give us to enlighten us this evening regarding the international perspective of space diplomacy in Indo-Pacific. So this research project is led by Miss Yunita, which is the second national competitive grant obtained by our center. The first one was in 2019 when we do research on the economic aspect of remote sensing. And the second one is on the space diplomacy in Asia Pacific. And this research project program is under the Indonesian Institute of Science. Here is Dr. Ganewati is the coordinator for that topics. So we are, again, thank you very much. We are very honored to have you here with us. And back to you, Mr. Tio, to continue the event.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Heru, for the brief welcoming remarks. Before we hear the presentations from our distinguished speakers, let us hear a brief presentations on the research from our lead researchers, Ibu Yunita Permatasari. So that it hopes that during our panelists' presentations, the panelists might also give a comments and suggestions on the research that is going on. So Ibu Yunita, the screen is yours, Ibu.
Thank you very much, Mas Aristio, for the time. The Honorable Director of the Center for Aerospace Policy Studies, National Institute of Aeronautics and Space, LAPAN, and also the research manager here, research manager of National Research Priority in Social Humanities, Ibu Ganewati, and a keynote speaker today, Prof. Danielle and Dr. Rajagopalan. It is an honor and a valuable time for our team, for us here to have you. Thank you for your time, Professor, for joining us today. And ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning in the US, good evening in Jakarta, India, and good day, everyone. And I would like to represent my team here to give a brief of our overview of our research and with the entitled Indonesia role on space diplomacy in Indo-Pacific. I think the share screen can be started. Okay, and this is our team with Bu Uis, Bu Dini, Bu Sinta, Mas Deden, Mas Joko, and Mas Aristio, and also me to leading the research team of the PRN Pusat KKP 8. And the next slide, please. Here, we will give a sort of the background of the research come from the Space Action Center and Indonesia itself. And we are recalling that outer space characteristic with wealth of the non-material and material resources, and it is free to explore by all the countries without discrimination for peaceful purposes and with the principle of non-appropriation. So, but the a characteristic of the outer space that high tariffs and the high cost, it will make the emerging space countries difficult to tackle, or it's become the limitation of the capabilities of the emerging space countries, but it will become the domination of the spacefaring countries itself. And then the space is becoming a strategic domain right now that's increasingly with the competitiveness and the congested and the contested areas. So, with the furthermore, with the dual use of the nature of the space that blur the political demarcation responsibility, it is from the peaceful and the security itself. And then space becoming strategic because the global space economy value that approximately until $140 billion. So it is what the characteristic of the outer space and what the strategic mean of the outer space right now. And the Asian century, where the Indo-Pacific region there, it is very nice to know that Indonesia is one of the top climber state, and we are aware that on the space domain, that in this area, not only for mitigating disaster or only for the socioeconomic benefits, but also for the national security itself, because it is why the need of national security, because the region has potential on real conflicts or fragile state here. And then in this region, that the national security, it's very important to maintain how the socioeconomic benefit can be achieved, and how the Indonesia has a strategic on geographical and astronomically positions. So we have a very high of the diversity, and also we are prone of the disaster, natural disaster, and then we are as a geographically, we are need the satellite infrastructure for the communication and the others. And from the astronomically, we are as the equatorial state that we are a very beneficial strategic position for the slot and or the of the geostationary orbit. And then we are as the pioneer of the institutional of the space agency, and as we have the space agency Lapan in 1963, and then we have increasing capability technique on space technology and science. And then also we are committed to develop our national arrangement to comply with an international arrangement. And next slide, please. And then we want to give a brief here that space diplomacy is the common interest of all of the nations, because in the globalization era, world faces issues that cannot be resolved unilaterally, and it is the urgent need, important need for cooperation among major powers and all responsible countries to resolve all of this issue. And also with this region in the Indo-Pacific, we have a lot of issues from the traditional traits until non-traditional traits, and we are very close as a responsible countries here, as we are located in the heart of the region, and then we know that the major powers here, so let's we have a more or greater cooperation to tackle all of the issue. And then we want to recalling that space diplomacy is one of the 4 pillars in the Unispace plus 50 in 2018, and it is the objective of the Space 2030 Strategic Vision Agenda and the implementation plan that approved in UN co-position in 2021. That we know that UN COPOS is the global forum for the cooperation of a space, so it is need to continuing of the agenda in the region. And then we know that space diplomacy in the meaning or definition is to build partnership and strengthen international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. So in this region, we want to more focus on the cooperation on the peaceful area, that is how to tackle non-traditional threats like a disaster management and the others, and also how to achieve our goals on SDGs, and also how to make a greater economic side or economic development in every country in this region. And the cooperation itself has a challenge because of the dynamically of the cooperation, because there all of the countries here has their histories, and it influenced by their ability that has a gap on the ability. Not all the countries here as a major power as spacefaring countries, but also as a space emerging space countries, and I think almost all of the state in this region are very newly maybe to know about the how the space to tackle all of the issue of the region. So, but we know that we are as a responsible countries in this region, so we have to compromise together. We have to negotiate it. We have to more a greater cooperation with the very a lot of various form from the G to G, maybe B2B or P2P. And the next slide, please. And it is how Indonesia right now on the regional space diplomacy, especially on the Indo-Pacific, assisting. We are as the executive secretary and the national focal point of ICC of UNSCAP, and then we are executive committee and a group of NSLI APR staff to study about how the national space legislations. It is very important, I think, to discuss more about the governance of the region. And then we are the signatories of the APSO, and then also we are the member states of the various organizations in this region, from the UN, maybe CSSDA, PRCS, SDA, PAP, and SCOSA, ASEAN, and the others. And then also we will be a host on the space event. In the next year, we will become the host of the Space 20 and the UNSCAP meeting, and at the 2023, we are as the host of the APR staff. And we have a bilateral agreement on the space activity in this region with all of the various countries, from the major powers into the emerging space countries. And then that we highlight here, we are as the contribution as the first vice chair of the committee of the UN Caucus in 2018 until 2019. So we are very committed to make a greater discourse of the space in the regional or in the global. So how Indonesia in the domestic, so we have a very committed to this, and it is that we can expect from the Indonesian space diplomacy is the four core values here. First one is the political value that we are have independent and active foreign policy. So it is a very important thing to us that we are a very independent to have a cooperation with all of the countries without any means of the committed. And then we are as the natural leader of the ASEAN. So we are will, as the ASEAN is located on the heart of the Indo-Pacific region, so it is very huge mandatory for Indonesia as the natural leader ASEAN to commit that this space technology and science will be as the peaceful that will be peaceful in the region. And then we are as the pioneer of the Space Agency and the Space Act. And then also in the strategic economic value, we are, as we said before, as geographically as the archipelagic state, and astronomically we are the equatorial state. And then it will give us a benefit of the to have a spaceport, and then because it will be the first equatorial spaceport in this region. And then in the geographically, we are very committed to have a huge of the satellite infrastructure and a space infrastructure for our good communication for the archipelagic state. And then in the technical value, we are has Lapan A2 under Lapan A5 satellite that we are try to make it by ourselves and own in Indonesia, and we have the Anitrix chamber, a satellite control center, and then the remote sensing national data bank. That it is a very important to have the remote sensing national data bank, because we use it to achieve to monitoring of the climate change and the others. And then the space-based decision support platform, we are continuing to develop it because it is give us more power for not only monitoring but also for the assess how the climate change mitigation, how to achieve other space sustainable development goals and the others. And then also in the we have a satellite launch vehicle development. And from the governance value, we have a foreign affairs A in 1999, and then we have a space A in 1913, and we have a space master plan in the presidential regulations 2017. And then we have the government regulations about the remote sensing itself in 2018. And it is very valuable for our team because we have the international perspective from Professor Suzuki Kazuto and Professor Stephen Freeland before, that they are have highlighting in the issue in the region, that not only how to make a greater cooperation, but also how there are so much issues on the space itself that Indonesia must be committed to. So now very happy to have Professor Danielle and Dr. Rajagopalan here to know about how the perspective from the US and the perspective from the India, and have alignment for us, for our research, and for make the greater cooperation and make a regional space diplomacy. Also, Indonesia will contribute more on this. Okay, and I will close with the reminder for the national seminar of ours. It is in the space diplomacy itself in the big term, and it will be held on the September on 2021 with the keynote speaker. One of this keynote speaker here is our Excellency Minister of Foreign Affairs of Republic of Indonesia. So I close with the kuasa nuklir antariksa untuk menjadi negara besar, Presiden Soekarno. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Arsia.
Thank you very much, Yunita, for the very brief presentations of the state of the research, as well as for highlighting several of the Indonesia's modalities in regards to space diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, as well as you mentioning the core values of Indonesian space diplomacy, such as the political values, strategic value, technical, and also governance value. Thank you very much, Yunita. I hope that later on during the panelist presentations, the panelists might give suggestions, comments, or how this research can going forwards. So before we start to the presentations from our distinguished speakers, so please let me briefly introduce you the profile of our speakers. For those of you who are working on space diplomacy issues, I think our speakers really need no introductions. So let me just briefly read short of their bio. So our first speaker is Professor Danielle Wood, who is an assistant professor in the program in Media Arts and Science, and holds a joint appointment in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States. Within the Media Lab, Professor Wood leads a space-enabled research group which seeks to advance justice and Earth complex systems using designs enabled by space. In her research, Professor Wood applies these kind of skills, designs innovative systems that harness space technology to address the development challenge ground in the world. Prior to serving as the faculty at the MIT, Professor Wood held positions at NASA headquarters, NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, Aerospace Corporation's Johns Hopkins University, and the United Nations Office of the Outer Space Affairs. So thank you very much, Professor Wood, for joining here with us today. It's really a pleasure for us. And our second speaker would be Dr. Raji Rajagopalan, who is a director for the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundations in New Delhi, India. Dr. Rajagopalan was a technical advisor to the United Nations Group of Government Experts on Prevention of Arms Race in the Outer Space. Dr. Gopalan was a non-resident Indo-Pacific Fellow at the US Asia Center. Dr. Rajagopalan joined the ORF after 5 years of stint at the National Security Council Secretariat, Government of India, where she was an assistant director. And prior to that, at the NSCS, she was a research officer at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. She was also a visiting professor at the Graduate Institute of International Politics, National Chongqing University in Taiwan. So thank you very much, both our distinguished speakers for making a time joining here with us today. So our two speakers will, each of the speakers will be delivering their presentations for about 40 minutes each, and then will be continued by a Q&A sessions for around 30 minutes. So for those of you participants who have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation of our speakers. So without any further ado, Professor Wood, the screen is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today, and it's my pleasure to share. May I just confirm that the sound is working? Okay,
yes, it's
wonderful.
Perfect, Professor.
Thank you so much. I look forward to highlighting today, and actually I was so happy to receive an invitation from Lapan to speak, partly because of your long history of accomplishments and of research in the areas of aeronautics and space, and also because over the last year and a half, I have developed further research relationships with several university teams in Indonesia. I want to particularly highlight Professor Yoga Setiawan at Diponegoro University, and also multiple other university teams and professors. We have had a chance to collaborate via a cooperation between my university, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and organizations seeking to build a link between universities in Indonesia and MIT. And so we are thankful to work together, and we have explored research together in areas including using satellite data to address coastal resilience, as well as actually during the pandemic, we have been collaborating on using information from space and from non-space sources to understand better what's happening with COVID in the environment and policies and socioeconomic outcomes. I'll show a few examples, and I just want to say thank you to our collaborators there. Now I will share my screen and introduce my discussion today. The goal of my talk is to ask, what does it mean for space to play a role in sustainability, both on Earth and in space? And I think every country has an opportunity to play a role in increasing the use of space for sustainability. Now, one definition for sustainable development or for progress towards sustainability comes from the global consensus just devised here in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, during the time of the pandemic, we've had to ask the question, are there some challenges with meeting these goals that are made even more challenging because of the pandemic? Space does play a role to address many of these goals. In particular, it's certainly linked to all the environmental related goals, especially number 13 on climate change, 14 on life below water, 15 also on life on land. But also space can play an indirect role to contribute to topics in areas like hunger and addressing the sustainability of cities. This is just one of the multiple ways that countries and non-state organizations can define progress towards sustainability. And perhaps there are others that you use in your own work. But either way, we certainly want to set bold visions for what it means to bring our communities into a sustainable outcome with regard to environmental progress, human needs being met, but also economic growth in a way that's balanced. One of the things my team also asks, beyond just on Earth, we also can ask the longer term question, because humans are preparing to have great impact also on locations beyond Earth. In a way, we can also note we've already had a lot of impact on the orbital space around the Earth. I'll speak a bit later on the challenges of space debris and the call for every country to play a role to cooperate on addressing space debris, but also as humans prepare to have activities on places like the moon or asteroids or Mars, we have not yet written sustainable development goals for those locations. And in fact, we have not done as much environmental damage in those places either. But I have an essay I can reference for you called Creating Our Sustainable Development Goals for Mars, highlighting the fact that as humans continue to have impact on different locations, even beyond Earth, we will continue to need to push ourselves to sustainability. Now, work on sustainable development in any form toward the SDGs or toward national goals is about designing complex systems. And part of the challenge is that we have to consider a balance between environmental, economic, and social relationships. And of course, when you consider geopolitical relationships, also it adds some complexity. And part of the benefit of applying space for this decision-making at the national or regional or local scale is it helps us manage these complex relationships and consider how to make decisions even under uncertainty. So I'll also show several examples today from my own research and from activities that I'm aware of that relate to applying space to make decisions for governments, non-government organizations, for community leaders, as we seek to work towards sustainable outcomes, reducing poverty and increasing access to basic needs, but also cooperating internationally. In my work, I've identified 6 areas of space technology that already play a role to help contribute to addressing sustainability on Earth especially. And we can also ask how to design these technologies so they contribute to sustainability in space. This includes satellite Earth observation, satellite positioning and navigation, the benefits of human spaceflight, including the knowledge we gain through participating in microgravity research, satellite communication, which provides infrastructure for connecting around the world, technology transfer from the space sector to other fields, as well as the benefits of fundamental research. And of course, we consider that certain countries in their geography provide opportunities for particular types of scientific research, such as studying the relationship between the sun and Earth's magnetic field, or understanding what's happening in the ionosphere, or providing access to certain kinds of astronomical studies. So all of these areas are opportunities for connecting a space technology to a need on Earth, or for designing a space technology in a way that's sustainable in space. Many countries around the world are already demonstrating that they value space as a source of infrastructure. These tools we mentioned, especially for satellite services, remote sensing, communication, and positioning, can support the efforts of a national government or other entities on sustainable development. So I want to highlight a few examples from my long research for the last 15 years, asking leaders around the world why they are pursuing space activity and what goals they seek to pursue. And I will show you many countries from the Indo-Pacific region in the examples. I'll start with examples from Africa. I first started studying space activity in Africa around 2006. I identified a few countries that were active, especially in using satellite services, but also going beyond to increase their local capability for having national ability to build and operate satellites. In 2008, I published a document for my master's thesis highlighting that every country in Africa was using remote sensing, communication, and positioning services. So that you could say on the pyramid there, every country was involved with this sort of lower base of the pyramid. And a few countries were also investing in building satellite hardware as a national project and building expertise in the country and increasing infrastructure for testing or operating satellites locally. This is really continuing to increase. And of course, now we see the announcements around the African continent scale space policy and an African space agency that will cooperate through the African Union. And so, of course, countries like Algeria and Nigeria, Egypt and South Africa were some of the early actors, especially at these levels of building local expertise and hardware and infrastructure in their country. And you see some of the dates there for those activities. And you see now more and more countries are also getting involved to further their domestic activities in space. And what is interesting is the opportunity provided by smaller satellites. That means that countries can have multiple satellite projects at a reasonable budget. And it's an opportunity for cooperation in the broader Indo-Pacific region. So I consider the capabilities and the activities within LAPAN and ask, are there ways you can be collaborating with some of these emerging countries also in the African region? I'll give a few examples of the recent news. Just in the last year or so, we noticed Mauritius deploying their first satellite into low Earth orbit, and of course through cooperation. And they had a chance to explore through their National Research Foundation how to apply these capabilities for national response. Tunisia also recently announced the launch of their first satellite. And these are just a few examples. It's not complete, but to highlight some of the major news recently. We can also highlight Rwanda and their first satellite being released from the ISS. Other countries to consider include also Angola, that has had several projects recently, and others that there's too many to name actually. But the idea here is that multiple countries, both in Africa, but also in Latin America and different parts of Southeast Asia, are having this milestone of their first national satellite. And they also view it as a long-term activity for cooperation, as well as for building professional capability among the people in the country. I've had a chance to visit multiple countries around the world to ask about their space policies. I'll just show a few examples of the images to give even further, convincing of the point. This is in Nigeria, the model of their first satellite. In South Africa, of course, we've seen their examples, and they've had both at the national scale and at the commercial scale, a lot of success with small satellite development. In Ghana, they are participating along with South Africa and other countries in the Square Kilometer Array project, which will be a continent-wide activity for increasing an opportunity for studying astronomy via a network of telescopes through radio astronomy. I showed the example of Mauritius, and here's some of the team members that worked on their first satellite. And this is before the pandemic, when they were hosting a regional conference for space activities. In Chile, we can also go to the other side of the Pacific. We see a similar example where the country has a long heritage with regard to astronomy activities, and also has developed on both the military side and now the university side capabilities for developing satellites. Professor Marcos Diaz is here highlighting the first university small satellite laboratory and the development they are doing for increasing student skills and professional skills in that area. I give an example from Venezuela. They have coordinated with multiple countries, including China, and are developing a space agency and multiple projects as well. And I have a colleague who has worked in Sudan and had experience of working both locally as well as internationally on satellite projects. And so I just like to note that it's really quite ubiquitous if you look across the globe, and particularly at the Indo-Pacific region, that there's a commitment to university level, research level, and also government level activities to increase local capability to build and operate satellites. But it's because countries value the capability for remote sensing, communication, and positioning as part of tools to provide information about sustainable development, or as opportunities to increase innovation in the country. Also, of course, we can think about the UAE. This is showing early photos of their ground station. Of course, they have recently been able to cooperate and have an international mission that goes all the way to Mars. So in the UAE case, they've had very high ambitions and been able to participate with leaders around space and around the world and increase their activities. And of course, they're planning additional missions with astronauts and to the moon as well. This picture is from Vietnam, and I've had a chance to visit their National Space Center, also a very cooperative country that seeks ways to build capability through collaboration. And I can mention visits to Singapore and to Malaysia. And I have not yet made it to Indonesia. I apologize because I'm showing my visits across your neighboring countries, and I hope in the future to visit also and to learn more about the policies and the motivations for space activity in Indonesia. But it's been a pleasure to learn the reasons that different countries, like in Thailand, you see here, have invested in space, particularly to increase their access to nationally operated satellites for observation of the environment or to communication services. I'll close with the example from Malaysia, highlighting, of course, their multifaceted space program, including an astronaut program, satellite projects. And this is the National Museum that both has space education and also exposure to astronomy. So of course, we're convinced that countries all over the Indo-Pacific region are active in space, that see a reason to invest in space activity for education, for infrastructure, and for bringing innovative activities and changing the skill sets of people in the country. Now let's look at concrete examples of providing practical tools from remote sensing to enable policy for ground-based, earth-based sustainability. Again, referring to the Sustainable Development Goals, I want to highlight in particular SDG number 15 and 14. Both of them address some of the key topics relating to sustainability in a region like Indonesia, where you have multiple islands, and of course, the impacts of climate change and of environmental variables like air quality are key to the quality of life. And I've had the privilege to explore some of these topics with scientists also from Indonesia and also from NASA. And so we are sometimes doing projects related to SDG number 15 in Indonesia, but also other countries near the equator that are experiencing impacts of climate change even now. Now, the benefit of satellite systems that observe the Earth is that they give global views. Although, of course, you'll notice in the image, many of them orbit north to south, which means that they may not cover the countries near the equator as often, but at least they provide global revisit regularly. and we can understand how often they'll pass over. But actually, it's an opportunity for countries that are located near the equator, like Malaysia did, to explore orbits that focus on revisit over the equator more often. Now, from these data, I'm showing here the examples from NASA, their Earth observation systems. But of course, there are more satellites observing the Earth from other countries around the world. I used to work for NASA, so I mentioned their examples, and I'm most familiar with those. But we can also consider data from European systems and Japanese systems and Indian systems. All around the world, there is data being shared. And some of the data is shared freely at no cost. Some is shared at low cost. This kind of data can be put into models, computer models that use physics-based math, and they organize simulations or actual calculations of what's happening around the world based on both data, but also estimates from physics. Here's an example highlighting a global estimate of the temperature of the ocean, along with the patterns of global tides and global currents, I should say, that are passing through the world. And this matters because the temperature of the ocean and the patterns of the currents influence the patterns of rainfall. So we can also draw from direct satellite observation. This is an example called iMerge that NASA publishes in collaboration with several other countries that produces a regular estimate of global rainfall and snowfall, which of course can be used to understand weather, but also to ask what are the patterns affecting the health of crops and the soil moisture, and also flooding and other impacts of rain. Of course, that then leads to the question of what's happening with vegetation. And looking either globally or locally, we can draw from satellite observations of chlorophyll and take estimates of what's happening either with vegetation, crops, or forest. SDG number 15 includes a lot of goals and targets around improving the health of forest, both for the environmental benefits as well as climate change benefits, and also to reduce concerns in areas like land degradation, as well as erosion in coastal areas. Some of my work and uses these capabilities of satellites to observe forest to look very locally at coastal cities to see how they are maintaining wetlands and coastal forests to protect the coastal environment. You can also consider, of course, atmospheric information that can be drawn from satellites. Satellites are capable of observing different constituents of chemicals in the atmosphere. This example from NASA highlighting carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. But of course, it's also possible to look at other pollutants and to consider the impact of aerosols. For the case of Indonesia, I've done a little bit of research to understand, of course, the importance of considering how fires or other human activities like coal burning power plants influence regional air quality. And we can use satellite data to estimate the impacts of pollutants in the air as well. Some pictures from space are not measurements, but just give us a visual view of what's happening. This example shows farming in the United States. Sometimes we are using the visual clues to help us understand how land use is changing. Other times we're using measurements like the impact of certain chemicals in the atmosphere to see how humans are affected by health. But either way, there's a lot of work to transfer these mini data sets into information that can be used by policymakers to actually answer a question. And of course, the technology is interesting. Here's an example of a traditionally built scientific satellite from NASA that's very large and very expensive. You can see the humans there on the left side. It's a vehicle the size of a large kind of truck or something that you might drive on Earth. And it will last ideally for multiple years, maybe for a decade in space. And it costs a lot of money to invest, but it then provides benefit for many years. This is, of course, in contrast with what you see with the movement to have smaller satellites, where each satellite is much smaller, closer to a small shoebox, for example. And these, of course, will not last as long in space, and they are not as reliable. And sometimes maybe one or two of them will break when they're first operated. However, they can provide a different kind of service. So in my work, I'm thankful to have satellite data from both the traditional large-scale satellites as well as the smaller ones that don't provide the identical data, but they provide different times to give you more frequent updates sometimes, or sometimes different resolutions of data, more detail or less detail. And so we try to use data from traditional scientific satellites as well as from commercial satellites like these operated by the company called Planet. Here's an example of these smaller satellites as they were released from the International Space Station, just a beautiful view of the Earth. Now, once we have all this data from these different satellites showing what's happening in the environment, in the oceans, and also in the atmosphere, and also in the vegetation, it's really actually a bit overwhelming because there's so much information that in order to transfer that into policy, it takes a lot of work. An organization like LAPAN plays a key role in this kind of transfer to have experts who understand how to use the environmental data and to turn it into maps or other results. Now that's just one piece, because I would argue that for sustainable development goals, whether we're working in one country at a very local level, like one city, or if we're working across countries, we have to combine 4 kinds of analysis: studying what's happening in the environment, what's happening with socioeconomic vulnerability, what policies decision makers are considering, and then also using the technology design tools to understand if we need to design new satellites or observation systems. So we have a tool at my team called EVDT, and actually we are using this now to do research with the teams in Indonesia that I mentioned earlier, and we are exploring the coastal resilience opportunities, especially in Pekalongan and other areas that are coastal and affected by flooding. It means we want to use satellite data to monitor the environmental changes, and then draw from local data sets and compare what's happening with the environment with the socioeconomic variables, such as understanding the demographics of a region or the types of household and housing that is there and how it's affected by the environmental changes. It also means we are trying to make it easier for city level decision makers to use data from satellites to inform their plans for things like growing mangrove trees as a way to improve coastal safety. So here are some images highlighting our initial work in Pekalongan. Of course, many of you may be familiar with the challenges they face with land subsidence and coastal flooding. And we were invited by the city planning team to gradually work together to build a computer-based website that can be operated on the internet and have data from publicly available sources, combining data about the environment, about socioeconomic impacts from this flooding, and also considering what might happen with different policy options, such as increasing the mangrove forest or increasing other forms of infrastructure in the city locally. This is an early phase. I want to appreciate a doctoral student in my team named Seamus Lombardo, who's been working with Professor Setiawan and others at Diponegoro University and other locations. And we are thankful for the cooperation with the city team in Pekalongan. Another example we are working on is in Benin. So here's a case where you can notice that across the Indo-Pacific region, there are multiple locations where common concerns are happening, even though there's quite different parts of the world, but near the equator, there are repeated challenges. So this is one opportunity for space diplomacy in the sense that it's an opportunity to use space in a similar way across different countries. So in the country of Benin in West Africa, in the city of Cotonou, there's a company also concerned with coastal resilience, in particular the impacts of an invasive plant on a water ecosystem on a lake. And so we work with this team called Greenkeeper Africa, and we are trying to help them in a similar way to use satellite data to address local challenges. And just briefly show some images of the location there, where they are serving a community with many lower income households that have a very traditional way of living, using mainly human powered transportation in these boats. And they are often influenced by this plant, which causes concern for transportation, especially in the canoes and the human powered boats. And the plant is not local. It was brought by humans from the Americas, and it's called the water hyacinth. I think it's very active actually in other parts of the world. So maybe you also have this concern where you are. Because of the water hyacinth, the economic opportunities for trade and for access to even doing things like buying clean water are impacted for the people that live in this traditional style and use the human-powered boats. And so Greenkeeper Africa is interested in using satellite data to monitor the behavior of the plant. They also hire people from communities impacted by the plant to clean it and to turn it into a commercial product that can be used to clean up oil spills. And here's an example of us using satellite data from free sources, including NASA and the European Space Agency, to create an information tool. So it's a very local example, but it could be repeated in other locations. And we are able to demonstrate with multiple years, about 20 years of satellite data, the increase and the growth of the plant and the fact that it is continuing to worsen as a concern for the region. And we were also coordinating with the local teams to learn how we could collaborate where they could operate drones. And we were demonstrating with them with an experienced drone pilot to see if they would like to use this as a technique. It's great also that in our cooperation with the universities in Indonesia, they were using similar methods to combine observations from space and from drone access. And then also sometimes we put sensors in the lake itself. And all of this can be combined if we use these very helpful software tools to make a website that can organize the information in an easy way for policymakers. We have to also visit the sites ideally. And so I'm waiting for my time. Actually, we won a grant from MIT Indonesia, and soon I hope to come visit. We hope to come last year, but of course we had to cancel because it's important to do the research also in the field and to learn about what's happening locally. And this is for my team's visit to Benin. In Benin, we are building a website that will ultimately provide the data from the satellites, from the drone imagery, and from the field work we do and the sensors we put in the lake into one place. And it should be easy for people from a variety of backgrounds to understand the data. So these are ways to directly transfer the services from space into a concrete question, whether it's about coastal flooding, invasive plants, or other forms of coastal impacts from the environment. Also, in the case of Ghana, we're working on a similar topic related to mining and using satellite data and long-term observations from space compared to ground-based observation to make estimates of where there has been deforestation due to mining. And of course, these are complex policy issues for the national government, but having more information that is confirmed by observations from space can help to confirm. So you see the orange bars here highlighting the increase in the rate of non-regulated mining, especially in the areas in southwestern Ghana. And the team at the National Space Science Technology Institute in Ghana, as well as the Ghana Statistical Service, invited us to collaborate with them on this study. So we were able to identify the locations, especially you see in section B here, where mining has increased greatly in these last decade or so. And that provides information that the government continues to use both for past observation and for ongoing observation of the areas impacted most by mining. Our next step is going to explore the impact of the mines on water quality in the nearby rivers. I mentioned also that during the period of COVID, we had hoped to work mainly on coastal resilience topics with our collaborators at the universities in Indonesia. But because of COVID, we also adapted our methods to consider how to use satellite data along with other forms of data to respond to COVID. And so we started to collect the publicly shared public health information and to build models in collaboration with a researcher from Harvard's Medical School. And we built data, we found data with our partnership from the teams in Indonesia, trying to understand what was changing about the environment, socioeconomic changes, and policy changes. And so we ended up working with multiple countries during this project called VIDA, and to build this decision support system for each country using local data and also data from satellites. And that we built a software tool. This example is from Brazil, and it has the language locally from Brazil, and our version for Indonesia also, we are working to have it in a local language so that we can have information where you can ask questions like, how are the COVID cases changing? What policies for closures are in place? And have there been changes in socioeconomic variables, such as topics related to the unemployment or the use of transit systems? We worked eventually with all these countries, Mexico, Chile, Brazil, Angola, and Indonesia, mainly through universities and also through some government agencies. But it's a good example where the cooperation and the common vision to use space technology together is a form of space diplomacy as well, because we also host monthly meetings in which we invite the different countries to come together, and each is sharing a bit of their learning about how to use the different data sets in order to inform their COVID policies. And we mainly focus not on the full country, but on one or several cities in the country. So in the case of Indonesia, this is a summary of some of the data, but it's not up to date, it's from the first year, but just highlighting the data we had available, showing not Jakarta, but several smaller provinces. And we were looking at whether the changes in the mobility match the changes in policy. So the yellow line shows what happened where as you go farther down, it means there's more strict closures. And as you go up, you get more opening, and then you see closing again. And the cases are shown here in this purple line up to what we had available at the time. And the transit mobility is an estimate of how much people were active. And so you see a little bit of this case where people are returning to using mobility systems, even when the policy is actually encouraging more time staying at home. So it's helping us understand whether people are responding to the policies and whether the cases do seem to change based on the policies. We'll change to a slightly different topic now to highlight also the opportunities with microgravity research. So all those examples highlighted the benefits of what it means to use Earth observation as a form of sustainable development, both at the local scale, but also through international cooperation. I want to also highlight another space technology, which is microgravity research. And I'll say a bit more about it later on, but to say that there's certainly an increase now in the organizations that are getting involved. This is showing particularly the United States case, but highlighting that there are multiple agencies working together on the International Space Station. There's also companies or government agencies offering flights on parabolic flights or flights on rockets that give you a chance to do research in microgravity. And this can be very beneficial to basic researchers at universities. And one of our calls is to say, how will more countries get involved, especially as the International Space Station either retires or goes to a new management structure in the future? What will be the opportunities for countries like Indonesia to have increasing activity in microgravity research, whether it's on a space station or through rocket flights or plane flights? So that's one example I want to highlight. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, just to say that there are different forms for how a space station in the future could be operated. And for example, it could be operated as a public-private partnership where multiple companies and countries choose to work together. And this is a question of diplomacy as well, to ask, do countries want to invest together in creating infrastructure in orbit around the Earth to allow universities or companies or government agencies to perform research on microgravity? There are possibly interesting science questions to ask that can have benefit on Earth if we bring those results back to Earth, in areas such as understanding the human body and its impact during aging, or understanding how to produce healthy systems for clean water and clean air in a constrained environment. We note that a purely governmental system has some benefits, but it may be limited in who can get involved, meaning sometimes government systems do have some political limitations on which countries are allowed to cooperate. But a public-private partnership may have openness, both in the economic sense, as well as what we'll call an administrative sense, meaning they are open to people from different countries or different jurisdictions, but they're also able to function in a way that's hopefully affordable to multiple countries' backgrounds. So our hope is that in the future, it will not be a fully privatized activity in low Earth orbit, but instead multiple countries will be cooperating to ensure increased access to research on microgravity. Thinking about that, of course, we have to ask what will be happening in low Earth orbit and also other locations in orbit around the Earth to ensure space sustainability. In order for us to have space stations that different organizations might operate and to have safe operations, we would need to also ensure that there is a safe environment, considering the fact that there's already so much space debris, and there are many plans for new countries to operate and new companies to operate large constellations in space. So I want to present the idea that every country has a role to play in space diplomacy to increase what we'll call space sustainability. In the orbital regime, this focuses on the capability to continue operating missions safely in orbit around the Earth. But as we go beyond, I mentioned earlier the need for sustainable development goals for Mars, for the moon, for wherever humans have activity. Wherever humans do place infrastructure or missions, we have the question of how will we manage waste and how will we consider being a steward of these locations for future generations. My team has worked on designing a space sustainability rating to encourage responsible behavior in space. This was done in cooperation with the World Economic Forum, as well as a design team that included my team at MIT, the University of Texas at Austin, the European Space Agency and their Space Debris Office, as well as a commercial team called the Bryce Tech has expertise in the space industry. And we are seeking basically opportunities to share this regionally. We see that it has a lot of opportunity to be used by both government teams and private sector teams, both to request ratings for their missions, as well as to share information about why it's important to reach good practices in reducing space debris. So the space sustainability rating gives a score to a particular mission, which could be one or more satellites working together to achieve a goal. And the score represents the effort made by the satellite operator to reduce space debris and collision risk. And so I'll highlight some of the key points we include. This is announced 2 years ago, but we've been working for the last 2 years to design the technical details. And now in 2021, we've announced that the EPFL, which is a university in Switzerland, the EPFL Space Center will become the long-term organization to operate the space sustainability rating as a practical tool. And so we are transferring the capability to them. And they will soon prepare to work with organizations first to do demonstrations of the rating, but eventually to give full operational ratings. And the vision is that organizations that receive a rating, we ask them to consider publishing their rating publicly to show that they are making the effort to reduce space debris and that they are taking actions to reduce the effort, to reduce the risk. So some of the activities that they should do to reduce their risk as operators, they should ask, what is their impact on the space traffic environment? We call it the space traffic footprint or mission index. This means asking, once you add this new mission to a certain orbit, how much new risk for collisions or debris do you create? Particularly considering what happens at the end of life of the mission and how long it stays in orbit beyond its time of operating. We also ask if each organization, each mission operator is following internationally documented standards and regulations, especially those from their own country, but also from groups like the International Standards Organization and from the Interagency Debris Committee. And also we ask them to align with what's documented in the United Nations guidelines on the use of outer space, and all of our recommendations are sort of vetted against those recommendations. We ask if the mission has ability to avoid collisions, either because they have the capability for the satellite to move, or because they have people who are coordinating and communicating closely with other satellite operators in the case of collision. We ask what kind of data the mission is sharing in terms of how they communicate their location and their status to other operators or the government. We also ask how difficult it is to track and to identify and detect the objects that are put into space based on their size, their orbit, and what can be seen from optical and from radar telescopes. And for this case, I want to note, for Indonesia, as you consider questions of how to engage in space diplomacy, one question I urge everyone to consider is what role the country wants to play in detection of objects in space and sharing of that data with an international network. It's more and more possible to have moderate quality and moderate cost optical and radar systems operated by countries around the world to increase observation of the objects that are orbiting the Earth. And there's a need for this because, in fact, we don't have excellent information, meaning there's not publicly shared excellent information about where the objects are in space, and more transparency of where the objects are, I would argue, and others have argued, would be useful for greater ability to respond to collision risk, especially with an increased number of commercial missions who have the goal to provide global service, not just in one country, but in many countries. So we are encouraging more effort to be put in by countries around the world in participating in observation and detection of objects in space through both optical and radar systems. Also, we consider what will this mean in the future? Will there be a need to have global coordination on a space traffic management system? I can consider the history of atmospheric-based systems and cooperation that we have through the International Civil Aviation Authority, which has created a functional system so that planes can take off and land from different countries. We don't have quite the same exact kind of system for space, but we do have a great foundation from the point of view of certain assumptions and certain norms, and also treaty language that guides how we operate in space. But there's a debate happening around whether there should be a more formal cooperation or management across space traffic. I won't answer the debate here. I'll just highlight that our team did a research study to ask, what are the views of emerging space nations and those that have some activities in space, but are perhaps still increasing their activities? And what do they want to see in the design process and the architecture, you could say, of a space traffic management system? So I want to appreciate Miles Lifson, who is a master's student and now a doctoral student in the MIT, and I worked with him on this project. So our questions included, what are the opinions of representatives of emerging space nations on the design of a proposed internationalized space traffic management system? And we wanted to ask, what did they consider was important in terms of how to engage across different countries through a diplomatic process, how to build capability in their country, what kind of capability should be in the technical system, and how to bring the system together, what kind of design it should have. So we wanted to know if that differed across people, but also across countries. And we wanted to know how that could help inform future design of a space traffic management system. And this was an initial study, but it involved interviews with 15 people. And you can see it included a representative from Indonesia, but we're keeping the names of the people individually anonymous. But we wanted to show that we had coverage from different parts of the Indo-Pacific region, including the African region, Asia, Central and South America, as well as Europe. And the goal was to find out if there was some commonality in the concerns raised by countries around what process should happen to design a future STM system. Well, we found some important commonalities that most respondents commented. In fact, every respondent commented that there's a need to work towards some approach to managing space traffic in the future. So this was actually an interesting finding that was a very common view, and that their country would want to play a role in helping develop the system. So this is a key example of what it means to have space diplomacy, also to be part of these negotiations and to influence the foundation of this future system. or other functions, and that the countries would want to be playing in that role. So this was a very common finding. And this is important because when we started the research, some people from other countries would say, well, we don't think this is a concern for these countries that are labeled emerging space nations, but we were confident and we were interested to see the result that actually it is a concern for every country. We also asked things like what kind of venue would the countries prefer to have for discussing designs of STM, and many mentioned the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space, as well as other capability building workshops and even bilateral meetings. And the question we asked also included whether they prefer a more top-down or mixed approach. The top-down case looks like having one country or a few countries develop a system at first and then demonstrate that to others and invite them to join, versus a mixed approach where you might have some bilateral designs and some multilateral designs that are eventually brought together. So of course, this doesn't tell us the full answer, but it does show that there's an appetite for cooperation on the diplomacy side to help understand what coordination should be done in the future to help reduce collisions and risk of collisions, and to increase opportunities for sharing data about the location of objects in space. So we have a few recommendations that we published highlighting the fact that we should keep the cost affordable and make sure that there's possibilities for different kinds of countries to cooperate and exchange technically, and to avoid designs that exclude actors from getting involved, so that there's no reason that one particular country would be excluded and not be able to join. And also that many groups mentioned the need to maintain national control over their own space assets. So we found this to be very useful. I'm almost wrapping up, so I'll just highlight briefly the third example I mentioned earlier, the benefit of using microgravity as a research area to spur innovation. And I'll just show a few cases. As I mentioned earlier, we would argue that in future space stations, we hope that there's opportunities for many types of universities and government teams to participate in having access to doing research. Currently, there are many countries that send research projects to the space station. My team is actually preparing to send our research experiment to the space station in a few months. And so there are multiple countries, I think over 100 countries have had a chance to have some engagement with the space station, but it is not fully covering the whole world. But there are other ways to do microgravity research. This is an example of a very low cost way to simulate the impacts of weightlessness, such as having a plant that's growing on its side and rotating so that it is not experiencing consistent gravity, and it has the effect of a weightlessness experience. Also, there are drop towers, and these can be facilities that can be set up in a regional setting. This is in Europe, and they can give opportunities for microgravity experiments in a few seconds. Of course, you prefer to have permanent microgravity for the research, but even a few seconds can be informative. And sometimes before sending a project to the space station, people use these interim effects like a drop tower. And it's much more affordable to send something to a drop tower. Our team actually is preparing also to send an experiment on a suborbital rocket operated by Blue Origin. And again, it gives us about 5 minutes of microgravity, but it's a chance for the university to have a lower cost. It's a cheaper flight than it is to go all the way to the space station. So there may be ways through space diplomacy for Indonesia to increase regional access to these kinds of experiments. Also, I just note that sometimes we do microgravity research by having people simulate the experience of weightlessness through bed rest studies. And this requires international cooperation as well. And so there are ways to have experiences and research findings that relate to understanding first the impact of taking away the gravity and then of bringing it back artificially. This example is from Cologne in Europe and from ESA's research. But there are ways to reduce the cost, but still have multiple exposures to either weightlessness or the effects of microgravity. You can also, of course, consider plane flights. I want to show our brief example from the work our team is doing. We are trying to understand if beeswax can be used as a sustainable and non-toxic fuel for satellites. And so we have been doing experiments in our laboratory. And I just want to note that the physical equipment is not so expensive and could be available and replicated by universities around the world. And these experiments do not have to cost a lot of money to get started for universities. And the example here is we've had multiple graduate students, and I myself recently was able to fly with the Zero Gravity Corporation, where they take our plane flight to make these loops in the sky, these parabolic paths, and we get seconds, maybe 20 seconds at a time of microgravity. But again, it's cheaper than going all the way to an orbital mission. It helps us prepare for that design. And so we've been testing to see how the wax behaves, both beeswax and candle wax, to see if it's possible to have it operate in a way that can be manufactured actually in space to get fuel grains of just the right shape that will function well. But of course, it's also a lot of fun to do this research, and it certainly inspires students. The experiment you see there is developing new science, but also exposing students to the benefits of microgravity. And actually, my student, Christine, who's there, was hosted by the United Arab Emirates Space Agency on that flight. That was in 2018, our first flight experience. So as we heard earlier, of course, the Outer Space Treaty, highlights that the exploration and use of outer space should be carried out for the benefit of all peoples. And of course, we could ask, is remote sensing from satellites and communication systems and microgravity research truly available yet to countries from around the world? Actually, I think it's not as available as it should be. Although every country indeed is using these tools, and especially remote sensing, communication, and positioning systems, if we want to keep increasing the access to tools like microgravity research, to astronomy, and to the benefit of these areas of innovation, and we want to ask, as humans go beyond our current activities and we have even more impact on places like the moon or asteroids or Mars, will we be responsible and actually push for sustainability? And this is the great next step of space diplomacy, and Indonesia can play a key role. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Wood, for your very insightful and important presentations. I know a lot of things here, and thank you very much for sharing all your research works here in Indonesia, which I'm very, very glad to see that. And I think we all agree with one of your most important point, that every country has the role to play in a space sustainability. And that's why I think it's the role of diplomacy, space diplomacy here in Indo-Pacific, it's getting more and more important. So thank you very much, Professor Wood. Surely there will be a lot of questions during the Q&A sessions. Thank you very much. So the next speaker, I would be delighted to invite Dr. Rajagopalan. You have 40 minutes, Doctor. The screen is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening to all the folks joining from different time zones. First, let me thank the organizers, Lapan, for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to be part of this panel. It's fantastic to be discussing the Indo-Pacific space issues. In some ways, Danielle has covered a lot of the from a civil, peaceful uses of space perspective. I'm going to be looking at more from a strategic and security perspective. So I hope it is somewhat more complementary in nature and we are not repeating ourselves during this discussion here. So the Indo-Pacific region is going through a strategic flux owing to primarily due to the changing regional and global military balance, the growing trends of space militarization, even militarization and securitization of political and territorial issues means that there is a greater emphasis on hard power capabilities. And this is certainly beginning to play out in outer space affairs as well. The Indo-Pacific landscape, space landscape began to change very rapidly in recent times. There have been renewed anti-satellite tests, ASAT tests, starting with China's first successful anti-satellite test in January 2007, highlighting a new phase in space security competition among the Asian great powers. Other spacefaring powers are also re-examining their options, strategies, capabilities, and assigning a greater security role to their own space program. For instance, after the Chinese ASAT test, the US undertook its own ASAT test in 2008. The Operation Burnt Frost. The Chinese ASAT test also sparked a new debate in India, for instance, in how India should be defending its own satellites, protecting its own satellites, and what kind of measures India must come up with to, and this finally, in a sense, led to the Indian demonstration of its own ASAT capability in March 2019, following which India has also conducted a tabletop wargaming called the Indo-SpaceX with all stakeholders, including the scientific establishment, the military, and the other academia and think tank community as well. Along with the capability development, for instance, in India, there are also institutional changes that are being brought about. So there is a reshaping of the institutional architecture within India to develop long-term strategies for space utilization and the integration of space into the armed forces network. These developments, I argue that they are just merely a sign of the increasing insecurities on Earth and how outer space has also become one more domain where the terrestrial politics, the politics on Earth, the geopolitics of the Earth are actually now beginning to play out. The growing indicators of space security in the Indo-Pacific means that both use of space for terrestrial conflicts and conflicts about use of space is being played out. In fact, the first could also lead to the second, with greater integration of space in conventional military conflicts, leading to more insecurities and possible additional conflicts. But the impact of the changing global balance of power equations cannot be ignored. The changing power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific as well as at the global level have had an effect on the region and how outer space is being looked at in a sense by most players in the region. Given that many of the rising powers are in Asia and some of them are challenging the prevailing geopolitical equilibrium, there is a big focus on acquiring hard power capabilities, including in the outer space domain. While there are several internal and external factors pushing these countries to respond in a more aggressive manner, the consequences of these actions are difficult to predict unless states are willing to adopt measures that would bring about a certain restraining effect on the irresponsible behavior in outer space. So let me look at the emerging space security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. I think the 20th century space competition primarily played out between the US and the Soviet Union, and the technology was primarily in the hands of a handful of countries, a small group of countries. But today the situation has changed dramatically. There are more than 80 active space players today, which includes non-state, that is the private sector, commercial players, educational institutions, and others. While the private sector participation in space is still primarily a Western phenomena, this is changing in the Indo-Pacific, including in countries such as India and China, which have traditionally not shared space with private sector. Japan has remained somewhat more open to private sector participation as compared to India and China. Entry of the private sector is important because they bring about innovation and also they have been able to reduce the cost of access to space. Access to outer space over the last couple of decades has become a lot more democratized with the spread of technology beyond the handful of countries who cherished the uses of space earlier. This, however, is not the problem. Given the significant utilities of space to a number of civil applications in changing the lives of ordinary people, which Danielle had outlined in her presentation in detail, more and more countries are pursued and will continue to develop space programs. The growing number of countries with space program in Asia itself is phenomenal. Just to looking at the number of countries with independent launch capabilities in Asia: China, India, Iran, Israel, Japan, and North Korea. It's a sign of the increasing interest and sophistication of space capabilities in Asia. In addition, there are a growing number of emerging space players, including Australia, Bangladesh, Iran, Israel, Malaysia, North Korea, Pakistan, Singapore, South Korea, UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Vietnam. Indonesia is somewhere in between these two, I would think. It's not maybe not a full-fledged major power in that sense, but at the same time, it's not one of the emerging space players. Space security dynamics have become more complex, partly due to the crowded and congested nature of outer space. A direct issue that arises from a crowded outer space is space traffic management and orbital debris that have implications for safe, secure, and sustainable use of outer space. But space is a dual-use asset, which means that it has both civil applications and military functions. And many countries are beginning to use space for a variety of military and security applications today. Radio frequency interference, for instance, could be a result of the increasingly crowded and congested nature of outer space. But there are also increasingly deliberate attempts to jam or otherwise impede radio signals. Laser dazzling or blinding or using cyber means to create temporary disruptions, as well as denial of services, or generate interference in the command and control systems and logistics networks. These are new trends that we are beginning to see, and these are worrying. These measures, these kind of technologies, whether it is through electronic means, electronic warfare, or cyber means, these are also a lot more cheaper. They are easily accessible, and there is plausible deniability with these technologies, making them more attractive as an option for states. In general, the increasing willingness to develop and possibly use these counter space capabilities is quite worrying, and the trend is particularly evident in the Indo-Pacific. This, like I said, is fueled by the fact that the Indo-Pacific houses some of the fastest growing economies, which in turn has allowed for higher military spending, including in military space programs. In this regard, China's asymmetric rise as a major space player with consequences for regional and global security cannot be lost sight of. China's Mars mission this year its unmanned mission landing on the near side of the moon using Chang'e 3 in December 2013. And in January 2019, is Chang'e 4 landing on the far side of the lunar surface. These are all very, very impressive achievements by China, for instance. The next logical steps for China in this regard would be to have a human lunar mission. Beijing already has stated that its future moon missions will take it closer to the establishment of a possible research base on the moon. In fact, Russia and China has come out with the International Lunar Research Station proposal. China also plans to develop and operate its own version of the International Space Station in low Earth orbit by 2024, around there, by which time the current ISS, the International Space Station, might be winding up unless additional funding comes along to keep it running. China's growing sophisticated space capabilities in certain niche areas such as these have driven the other two Asian space players also to respond. India's recent attempt to soft land on the lunar surface, India's recent attempt to soft land on the lunar surface faced a setback. Nevertheless, it was a reflection of the budding Asian space competition. A successful mission would have made India the second Asian power to successfully carry out an unmanned lunar mission. 6 years ago, India, in its first attempt, became the first Asian country to send an orbiter around the Mars called the Mangalyaan. India's other important missions include the mission to study the sun called the Aditya mission, a second mission to the Mars, and a future Venus mission in partnership with France. But the emerging competition is not just in terms of attempting their own first, but it's moving to the security domain as well, with more serious security implications. India tested an ASAT weapon in March 2019, which was an effort to catch up with the capability that China had already demonstrated. After the Chinese ASAT test in January 2007, India had to possess its own deterrent capability to ensure that its own space assets are protected. Japan too has had an impressive achievement in space, such as the Lunar Orbiter mission in 2007, although it has followed more commercially viable projects such as the Hayabusa mission, the first time a spacecraft landed on an asteroid and brought back samples. Therefore, Asia will continue to witness both of these aspects, both of these races, in a sense, competition playing out, and both of these are driven by the terrestrial power politics than any other factor. Asia will continue to have important achievements, but there are tense geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region that will also intensify the space security competition and dynamics in the region. Let me look at some of the indicators of the conflict and potential competition in this region. Over the last decade, international tensions have risen in the Indo-Pacific region. This is partly the result of China's growth, but it's also the consequence of China's behavior in recent times. China has found itself in conflict with many countries in the region, including with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, Australia, Malaysia, Philippines, New Zealand, India, and also from far away in a sense. But partly as a consequence of this, there is also strategic collaboration, the cooperative aspects between countries like Japan and Australia, with India, and a number of other countries in the region, such as with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, Australia. Again, as a consequence of this, there is also the strengthening of relations between the United States and many of its partners in the region, which China sees with a lot of concern. But the result is that given these kind of increasing tensions, military space programs are becoming a reality. While some of the regional competition is giving way to a more cooperative ventures among like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific region, this is also driving states to develop more military space programs. Given that military operations are extremely net-centric ones, using shorter timeframes in a high-tech environment, integration of space has become absolutely critical. Operation Desert Storm and the Iraqi Freedom demonstrated the force multiplier nature of space, and since then, major militaries have studied options to make their militaries exploit space as well. At the very least, more and more militaries are moving to develop space-based intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR capabilities, positioning, navigation, and timing capabilities, satellite communication, intelligence, information gathering, weather, environment, and terrain observation. Space has come to have a multiplier impact in terms of gaining greater sense of predictability of the operating environment for military missions on Earth, thereby reducing the uncertainty and facilitating better command decisions. But these very same benefits become vulnerabilities as well. China, for example, has been investing in counter-space technologies such as electronic warfare measures, as well as cyber capabilities, because it looks at in a space capability, especially of the US, as one of the heavily networked countries in the region, in the larger Indo-Pacific region, whose vulnerabilities can be taken advantage of by China, especially in the middle of a conflict. This is also leading to the increased competition, is also leading to dedicated military space institutions. So one of the more direct manifestations of the growing tension is the establishment of specialized space security institutions. The establishment of the US Space Force by President Trump, of course, received astonishing amount of publicity by way of newspaper headlines. But the reality is that the US effort was only the latest in a series of such actions, and other major powers have been setting up such forces in the last several years now. Earlier in 2011, Russia, for instance, brought about certain institutional modernization, creating the Russian Aerospace Defense Forces, which are primarily meant for space security related activities. Similarly, in 2015, China established the PLA Strategic Support Force, the PLA-SSF, which saw the integration of the PLA space, cyber, and electronic warfare capabilities, again, considered as the major significant achievement, considering the future of warfare that would see the interface between all these three different capabilities. India has its own plans to establish a defense space agency. In fact, India has gone on to establish the agency. India has plans to establish a full-fledged aerospace command in the future. So the establishment of these kinds of specialized space units, dedicated military institutions, military space institutions, have important implications for the security in the Indo-Pacific. As space becomes more integrated and assumes more direct roles in conventional military operations, it can be expected that states would seek improved coordination of their military and security functions, which call for developing such specialized institutions. The French, for instance, went about creating their own space command. In September 2020, the French Air Force became the French Air and Space Force, completing a process initiated by President Emmanuel Macron in July 2019, when he announced the creation of a space command. Similarly, in May 2020, Japan launched a new space defense unit called the Space Operations Squadron, part of the Air Self-Defense Forces, to protect the Japanese satellites from threats. So therefore, I think there is a usefulness to looking at, first of all, acknowledging that more and more countries are going down this path of establishing such dedicated military space units. Without acknowledging this, it will be difficult to logically understand the rationale for such moves and the security conditions that are pushing these countries to take such steps. As space gets more further integrated into conventional military operations, the need to bring better coordination through institutions such as Space Force is real. While Space Force may sound like a fighting force, in reality, it mostly seeks to achieve greater integration of functions and improved coordination levels among the different agencies involved at the state level. Nevertheless, it is important to devote attention to these institutional changes and the bureaucratic innovations because of their implications in the national security realm. Also, bringing to the open as much as details as possible is important because in the absence of information, public debates become unnecessary, alarmist, and shrill, which is not helpful. Absence of information can also heighten the security dilemma, which could further prompt more countries to go down this path. A few countries doing this and lack of information on why they're doing it could be detrimental and negative effect, bringing about negative effect for all of the countries in the region. The establishment of space-specific organizations such as space commands clearly do not mean that we are about to enter a shooting war in space, but things are getting somewhat out of control with the increasing space weaponization trends. Therefore, I would argue that there is a usefulness to having a fuller appraisal or information sharing of such institutions and their purposes in removing some of the alarmist trends that we are seeing in terms of the narrative that prevails currently, and create more transparent and sensible debates on the realistic roles of these Space Command and Space Force institutions. Open debates of these issues can be an important transparency and confidence building measures. This is one of the global governance measures that have been thought about and debated for quite some time. With the prevailing great power politics, dialogue and transparency measures are important to stem the current trends where countries feel the establishment of specialized military space units are a way to secure themselves, especially since these new forces and commands are coming up primarily to aid greater coordination, openness, transparency to a great extent. These should be doable. These can go a long way in removing some of the misperceptions and miscommunication among the major spacefaring powers. It's obvious that it is in the interest of every major spacefaring power to push forward certain norms and broad rules and regulations that guide the activities of the space forces and commands. But we are only at the beginning of the process, and only a handful of states have so far established such specialized institutions. There is still time to regulate this space and not make it a dangerous one. Even until a decade ago, space was not implicated by terrestrial geopolitics, but that cannot unfortunately be said today. Just excuse me. So I would say that I think there is still time to regulate the outer space domain and not make it completely dangerous. Like I said, even until a decade ago, space was not implicated by the terrestrial geopolitics of the Earth, but that cannot be unfortunately said to be the case today. The growing insecurities among the Asian powers are visible, including in outer space affairs. Coming to the, I already touched upon the PLA and other countries that are pushing for the space military institutions. Let me just come to the indicators of space competition in a sense, and why countries are going to go down this path increasingly unless we take some effective steps. India, if I were to look at the case of India, for instance, India over the last decade has begun to respond to many of the changes in the neighborhood and beyond. The changing nature of warfare, along with greater integration of space assets into conventional military operations, has driven India, for instance, to adapt with its own capacity building and institutional architecture. This has not come easy for India, a country that has traditionally maintained that space must be used only for peaceful purposes. At the same time, India cannot ignore the developments in its neighborhood and beyond. India's concerns around space militarization and the early trends towards space weaponization of space are real. But the new developments have made New Delhi approach space from a more nuanced perspective. For instance, India's utilization of space assets for passive military applications such as surveillance, intelligence gathering is a case in point. India has increasingly come to rely on space for command and control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance purposes, the C4ISR requirements in a sense. India is increasingly mindful of the fact that as militaries get dependent on space, there are also growing vulnerabilities with states developing capabilities to interfere with, disrupt, or damage those outer space assets. The worsening trends in the overall security environment have further pushed India to get proactive in the last few years. India's ASAT test in March 2019 is a consequence of this nuanced approach to space security. Further, India has gone on to establish the Defense Space Agency, a front runner to the full-fledged aerospace command that is set to come up in a few years' time. These institutional structures are much required to bring greater synergy between the Department of Space, for instance, Ministry of Defense, and the armed forces. India took the first step in this direction in 2008 with the establishment of the Integrated Space Cell within the Integrated Defense Headquarters. But the usefulness of the DSA, or the Defense Space Agency, is to bring about better integration among the civilian and military departments of the government. While the DSA will be dealing with the strategy and policy questions affecting space utilization, India is in the process of establishing a defense space research organization along the lines of the Indian Defense Research and Development Organization. But India has to come out with a new space policy so that it becomes somewhat more open. This openness and transparency aspects are taken care of, and that can actually bring about greater clarity both for domestic context, but could also increase the sense of reduce the sense of competitiveness in the region in a sense. Let me wind up with looking at the drivers of space conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. There are three broad drivers to space conflict. One is the increasing use of space for military purposes. Second, civilian use that could also lead to conflict because of congestion and competition. And third, investments in military technologies such as ASATs, missile defense, and other counter space technologies. Each of the three drivers are playing out in the Indo-Pacific region, given that region also houses some of the new and rising powers. In the Indo-Pacific region, there are not only a growing number of space players, but the region also hosts some of the most advanced military space programs. The geopolitical competition, for instance, between India and China, China and Japan, China and Australia, are becoming new imperatives for these countries to develop outer space capabilities beyond pure civil space programs. Given the growing military dependency on outer space, countries are also developing counter space capabilities. China has grown leaps and bounds in this area since it has been looking at the US as the primary competition. The rapidly advancing counter space capabilities, including counter electronic and cyber warfare capabilities, are concerning to India, Japan, Australia, and of course the US and other Asian Indo-Pacific powers. Even though no country has placed weapons in outer space, India as well as other spacefaring powers are concerned about the growing ASAT capabilities that could also function as an effective A2AD capability during conflict. It's quite evident, like I said, no country would want to place weapons in outer space, especially, but using ground-based assets such as an ASAT missile to destroy a satellite or deny satellite-based services are a real threat in the Indo-Pacific. But space security threats could also be a function of civil space activities. For instance, the crowded and congested nature of outer space poses serious problems for most Asian nations as they are still expanding their programs. Increasing space debris with the possibility of risking space assets is a serious issue. Along with the amount of space debris, there is also the problem of proliferation of small satellites. Again, seen in a lot in the Indo-Pacific region, the proliferation of mini, micro, and nano satellites, which makes the challenge of monitoring and detection of these satellites a bigger problem. In fact, there is a global trend as well towards breaking bigger satellite constellations into smaller ones, given that they are easier to launch and deploy, and if interfered with or destroyed, for instance, during a conflict, for instance. At the same time, satellites have become a requirement for well-coordinated and synchronized tactical capability, integrating weapon systems, radars and sensors, missiles, and so on and so forth, in vast geographical spaces such as in the Indo-Pacific. But complicating these is the fact that space is a dual-use technology, and the entry of private sector in the military space arena has further complicated the issues in a sense. Launches carrying mixed payloads, for instance, make it even a bigger challenge. An industry, for instance, could be carrying both civilian and military payload, again, complicating the challenges already that exist in this region. The growth and dispersal of military technologies has also meant that many more countries are capable of investing in areas of technology that were previously limited to the superpowers. In addition, the spread of both missiles as well as the increasing dependence on space for civilian and military purposes has meant that the development of missile defenses and ASAT weapons have become more prevalent. Large number of countries now possess ballistic missiles. The spread of ballistic missiles technology has meant a simultaneous pursuit of defenses against these missiles, or at least the pursuit of such technologies have become more prevalent. So all of these are making the Indo-Pacific region more and more competitive, and the potential for accidents are also rising with this. The increasing dependence on space-based system, as well as the growing capabilities of rocket engineering technology and the more widely available sensor technology has also meant increased interest in ASAT systems. China's demonstration of the ASAT capability in January 2007, which was possibly driven by China's pursuit of asymmetric capabilities against the far more capable American military forces. But China's ASAT capabilities now allow it to attack a vulnerable link in the American military capability. But these same capabilities, even if directed at the United States, they have clearly implications for other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Japan, India, and other countries in Southeast Asia as well. Countries that are dependent on space for both civilian and military purposes, in a sense. So what can be done? The renewed emphasis on space security has brought the attention of all the key spacefaring powers to work towards some semblance of stability with regard to outer space activities. It is an entirely different issue that these countries are so far apart in identifying and agreeing upon major threats and the ways to address them. The existing treaties, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is the foundational treaty for outer space activities. But these have, while they have regulated outer space activities to a great extent, the emergence of counter space as well as other new threats in outer space cannot be addressed effectively by the current existing global mechanisms. There are gaps as well as ambiguities that should be addressed if one has to ensure safe, secure, and continued access to outer space. Given the worsening geopolitical trends, technologies with peaceful applications such as satellite inspection, refueling and repair, which is broadly called the on-orbit satellite servicing technologies, or technologies that are being used for cleaning up the space junk to get rid of the space debris. Again, these can be used for nefarious purposes. If a particular satellite can be deployed to remove a piece of debris, the same satellite can be used to carry out an attack on an adversary satellite and so on and so forth. China has ground-based direct ascent missiles that can physically destroy satellites, jammers that can interfere with, and lasers that can be used to dazzle or perhaps even blind imaging satellites, has done a series of tests of on-orbit proximity and rendezvous operations, even though this is not indicative of explicit offensive capabilities. Similarly, Russia has ground-based direct ascent ASAT system, and a range of GPS jammers, for instance. It is also engaged in a series of on-orbit proximity and rendezvous operations and demonstrations, both in low Earth orbit as well as the geosynchronous orbit, and has shown that there is a high priority in integrating electronic warfare into military operations. The US too has done multiple tests of technologies for close rendezvous operations. However, it does not have a declared direct ascent ASAT program. Nevertheless, it possesses the capability to develop co-orbit ASATs should there be a decision to do so. It is also likely that it has the capability to jam global navigation satellite service receivers such as the GLONASS of Russia, BeiDou of China, and other regional navigation systems. So there are a range of things that are already happening, and unless we have a successful multilateral efforts bringing back negotiations to in space, states will be forced to rely on deterrence as a way of defending themselves. Deterrence could produce cascading effects, because if one state relies on deterrence, others will be forced to as well. And the net consequences is negative for all. This could lead to increasing suspicions that will make cooperation extremely challenging. There is still time left because the deterrence model has not become state policy for any of the space powers as of today. But therefore there is a possibility to prevent it. One might add that it is necessary also because before states proceed down this path. Therefore, there is a small window of opportunity to halt the process of states pursuing deterrence as a state policy. But the bigger responsibility rests on the shoulders of all the major spacefaring powers to develop certain new rules of the road to address more contemporary threats in outer space. The debates on global governance have not really progressed much, and there are broadly two schools of thought. One school that suggests that developing legal instruments are the way to address gaps in the existing global mechanisms, whereas the second school argues that under the current international political and security climate, legal measures are unlikely to come about, and therefore have wanted to pursue political instruments such as the transparency and confidence building measures. There was an EU code of conduct that came about a few years ago, which did not really fructify, but that was a TCBM. That was a measure that was followed a few years ago, could not be adopted, even though the code ran into problems mostly on the process issue than on the content of the substantive issues of the code itself. But I think a point has to be emphasized here that the process is as important as the substantive content of a code or any sort of agreement that has come about. An inclusive process in developing a code or any TCBM or a legally binding agreement would mean there will be some compromises, but it would include a large number of states, and that will give these states a sense of ownership and responsibility to see that it becomes a successful measure. Therefore, one might argue that even if the document is less than the idea, because different states have to adopt, have to give in and adopt a certain amount of compromises to make some progress, it is more important to have a large number of stakeholders to ensure its durability. However, in order to develop a large support base among the Indo-Pacific countries, it is important not only to have a critical number of states being party to it, but also the critical states to be party to be brought into such kind of measures. The lack of consensus among the major powers today has hampered the process of developing effective global measures. Within the Indo-Pacific region, again, there is no unity of approach to global rules on the road on space. For instance, Russia and China have proposed a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, PPWT, first in 2018 and then in 2014. But this has not gathered much momentum, despite the fact that countries like India, for instance, have generally preferred a legally binding mechanism than transparency and confidence building measures. But in order to make some efforts, make some progress, there are those who argue for a middle path, saying that you can come up with legally binding TCBMs or transparency and confidence building measures. This has not generated much support as of now, but I think there is a possibility of this gaining momentum in the near future, given that the space security challenges are becoming a lot more problematic in a sense. Irrespective of the outcome on the global governance front, there is a need for developing an effective space situational awareness. Traditionally, the US has maintained the largest SSA network with radars and sensors, followed by Russia, which has a better coverage of the Southern Hemisphere. Europe has also developed certain capabilities in this regard, but in the Indo-Pacific today, you have countries like China, India, Japan, and Australia who are also developing SSA capabilities, and these need to be interlinked with other global networks. This is a relatively non-controversial area of cooperation that can instill greater confidence among the major players in the Indo-Pacific who otherwise seem to be having difficult relations. But any player that wants to play a major player, be a relevant stakeholder in the space domain, should develop these capabilities in order to have better awareness and of the outer space environment and how it impacts on their own activities in outer space. The three essential activities: tracking of objects in space, monitoring of space weather, characterization of the space objects, can go a long way in avoiding collisions. SSA is also useful in addressing space weather issues such as solar storms, explosion of charged particles, and so on and so forth. So let me now conclude. The challenges of space security are most pronounced in the Indo-Pacific region. There is clearly no defense against capabilities like the ASAT capabilities or other counter space capabilities. There are no effective arms control measures or even political agreements, the transparency and confidence building measures to address anti-satellite capabilities or other counter space capabilities. Key Indo-Pacific powers need to explore all ways to control these trends, including legal measures, norms, as well as the GG, the global group of governmental experts that comes under the that is instituted by the United Nations, as well as other measures such as the code of conduct, for instance. Given the continuing space security threats and the lack of progress on the global governance front, states need to invest in building better redundancy, hardening of space capabilities, and enhancing the security of backups. Let me stop here, and I look forward to your discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajagopalan. I think it's really interesting presentations on the security aspect of the use of the outer space, and I agree to all points that you make. I think there should be increasing of private sectors relevant in the outer space. And also, I think it's a very interesting point that you make that in the last 10 years, the geopolitical, there has been a lot of geopolitical implications to the outer space activities. But nowadays, since the Indo-Pacific is getting more relevant, I think the geopolitical situations very much have an implications to the explorations of the space activities. And also, I think it's also very important to note that, as we all knew, that one of the most important principles of the Outer Space Treaty is the peaceful use of the outer space. However, in the practical sense, that there are a lot of security issues and security challenge that come rise. And lastly, in your points, I think it's also very relevant and important that the Indo-Pacific countries should think how to keep this security and peaceful use of the outer space in the Indo-Pacific regions to any several other means, including like whether or not to regulate or have a more regulations on that issue. So thank you very much, Dr. Rajagopalan. We do have a lot of several lineup of questions here, but before I read out some of the questions, we are also delighted to have the Indonesian Consul Generals in Houston, Texas, who is very much dealing also with the issues of the outer space diplomacy issues. So I would give a floors maybe of 5 minutes, around 5 minutes to the Consul Generals to have brief comments, and also notes that you wanna say. We're really glad to have you here, His Excellency Pa Andre Omar. The screen is yours, Pa.
Thank you very much, Pa Aristio. And again, congratulations to Professor Heru Lapan for organizing this amazing event. Great to see again Pa Yunita and Pa Deden. And what a privilege it is for me to speak from Houston at, I think it's 9 o'clock in the morning. I see Miss Danielle Wood and also Miss Rajagopalan. Ms. Raji, I also want to comment that I was the senior official for the IORA forum. So as I listen to you, it feels like I'm reminded of just how strategic Indo-Pacific is. And Professor Heru, I think your topic here is very timely. The comparison between Indo-Pacific and space diplomacy, and being the only diplomat here this morning, I take note of all your recommendations. I look forward to facilitating U.S.-Indonesia partnerships, especially I've been talking to Pa Yoga now. Congratulations. I also want to acknowledge Ibu Ganewati Wuryandari. I think this is a very special event, and a lot to do, Pa Heru, because technically, I mentioned in yesterday's discussion, 2045, Indonesia, the US, and India will be the top 5 biggest economies in the world. Where are we going to go with that, Mr. Raji and Danielle? And as much as I was listening to Danielle speaking on the potential for SDG development, Pa Heru, again, Ibu Raji reminded us at the end, the Indo-Pacific may sound like a very good political topic, but it's much more heated than most know. One thing I want to add, Pa Aristio, is that one thing we forget is that for the 200 years ago, we had the transatlantic development where the economy grew in the Atlantic. This century, it's a Pacific year, the Pacific era. Next is the Indo-Pacific era, in which India, Indonesia, and the US have to play a greater role, because at the same time, China and other major countries will be there. I have 3 points I want to convey, Pa Heru, Mas Aristio. And at the end of the day, there's always this challenge. In the past, like Professor Raji mentioned, 10 years ago, it wasn't that prolific, the discussion on the Pacific. But this year, Professor Raji, I'm not sure if I wish to convey that as a senior official of Indonesia at IORA, we welcome France into the Indo-Pacific. So when Aristio was mentioning about who are the Indo-Pacific countries, they don't exist. We have IORA countries, but in the Pacific, everybody wants to join. Indonesia and Australia, we're in the middle with India. We're not part of the Quad, but this is a topic that we need to talk. And I think Lapan is an important partner. I hope, Heru, you will join us in IORA for greater deliberations, because Ibu Raji mentioned about the lack of governance. It's true. It's a space race. 10 years ago, people thought it was a very expensive project. Now it's too important, and we're using military to justify the big budget. And I hope that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can support Lapan, not only at the bilateral, the regional, the multilateral, and especially at the practical level. And as Pa Deden mentioned, I'm looking forward to bringing UNITA and also yoga to NASA. Just 2 points I wish to finalize, and the discussion might consider. Number one, how do we balance that? The space program is too important, by Heru, and I hope Indonesia, being a big country, we can learn from India also. And as you mentioned, Indonesia was a pioneer in 1962. How do we take it to 2045, by Heru, and what can we do to persuade Parliament and persuade the the administration, so we can spend more for Lapan on this important project. And number two, of course, how do we bring UNITA and Yoga and Deden to NASA and also to other programs, to the Indian space program? Because I think as active as we are with Pak Aristio, we're going to phase out. I mean, by 2045, it'll be Pak Deden, UNITA, and we'll be watching if our children will be in space. So how do we encourage more youths to be in this one? The Consulate General is here to facilitate, but I'm hoping that we can get more youth entrepreneurs, Pak Heru. Maybe we can we can watch the space launch of Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin from Texas, or Elon Musk's SpaceX from Florida, Pak. I'm looking forward to welcoming Pak Heru and Pak Thomas from Lapan to Houston. But one final thing before I conclude, the Indo-Pacific agenda, Pak Aristio, is now we're all focusing on the vaccines. So I think my foreign minister, I mentioned, was meeting with Minister Blinken just last week, and we committed to greater Indo-Pacific cooperation to take care of the vaccines. But as Danielle mentioned, I did not realize that you were working with people in Pekalongan. That's where my staffs come from. So really inspiring. I think Danielle has showed us, Aristio, that we don't need a governance or a military objectives to delve into the space program. The SDGs is important enough. And I'm hoping that through the consulate, we can facilitate both. We can have more governance and collaboration with India and the US at the same time. More scientists, more universities can work together, and I look forward to facilitating that. And I put my my contact details. And Pak Aristio, I hope I can welcome you in Houston, because this Indo-Pacific and space program is too strategic to be ignored. Thank you very much, and stand ready to support all of you.
Thank you very much, Pak Andre, for we're really delighted to have you here, and thank you very much for your comments. I think because of the output of the research, of this research, is particularly to give a policy recommendations in a concrete sense on how Indonesia can enhance more in the space diplomacy. So I think the diplomats and also our ambassadors abroad could be the best bridge in order to enhance more Indonesian space diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. So thank you very much, Pak. So we do have a lot of several lineup of questions here. So I will read it one by one. So please, Prof. Danielle and Dr. Rajagopalan, to answer the questions as brief as possible so that we can get more as many questions as possible. So the first question is from Ibu Sylvia from Lapan, to both Professor Wood and Dr. Rajagopalan. How the strategic and operational challenge, also opportunities of space governance in the Indo-Pacific. How the United States and India perspective of the prospect space governments in the Indo-Pacific and Indonesia's role on it. Is the questions clear? All right, so I think we will start with Professor Wood and then with Dr. Rajagopalan.
Thank you so much for the question. I can note that today I'm representing my university, but not really an official voice from the US government. In the past, I had a chance to work for the government, but today I'll speak as just a citizen. But thank you for asking. I think there are multiple layers of how organizations in the United States, or more broadly, universities around the world, are responding to opportunities in Indo-Pacific region. On one level, I'm so thankful to see cooperation and an eagerness for exchange in the academic community. So I think many universities are very open to being a part of international discussions, conferences, and trainings. I, for example, have a position at a university in Japan, which is the Kyushu Institute of Technology. And there are many opportunities, for example, for teams to gather from different countries and do trainings and things like small satellites and the engineering that's needed for this. Many countries are involved. So on the university side, I think there's many international conferences, and there's programs like the Space Generation Advisory Council, which is a program for young professionals between ages 18 to 35. Anyone can join from around the world and exchange on space. Of course, if you look at the commercial side, we are interestingly seeing more examples of multinational companies, meaning companies that are operating in space, but they have more than one country that they connect with. One example is thinking about launch vehicles, that companies that have a connection to the United States, but also to a different country. Or small satellite companies that may start in one country and also create an office in the United States, for example. I think this is an exciting piece. There, of course, are still policies that make it difficult, and you have to have special review of space technology exports out of the United States. So sometimes this creates a concern on the bureaucratic side. On the science side, I think when it comes to researching the Earth with data from satellites or doing research about astronomy or astrophysics or planetary science. We do see very strong cooperation, but I think there's a reason for even creating more settings for scientists to gather. For example, we have the Committee on Space Research, the COSPAR meetings that happen typically every 2 years. And this is a great environment for international science exchange, but I think it would be great to see even more cooperation and more participation from different parts of the world. So I think I'll stop there to say I mostly answer for the universities and for the commercial side. I don't want to represent officially the US government, only to say that in my time working at NASA, NASA does indeed have cooperation and agreements, like in the form of perhaps a memorandum of agreement with many countries around the world. And one example that is publicly shared is the GLOBE program, a way to incorporate school students who are learners at different levels, secondary and primary school, who can get involved with sharing data about the environment and a NASA website called GLOBE. So I encourage people to look at that as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Wood. Dr. Rajagopalan?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. In fact, looking at the whole question of space governance, but what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, I can't say that global governance or even terms of even regional governance mechanisms aren't easy to come by, especially in the Indo-Pacific, given the kind of changing regional power dynamics. You have 3 or 4 major rising powers at the same time in this region, and the kind of competitive history, the baggage of history that each of these countries carry is very, very huge in terms of all of these countries having gone into war with each other, whether it is India, China, Japan, China, Russia. So things are not easy in a sense, and plus these countries also have unresolved border and territorial sovereignty related issues, and which is shared by the Southeast Asian countries also when you look at the South China Sea issue. So the overall, the competitive political and security environment is not, unfortunately, giving much way in terms of hope for any sort of even at the regional level prospects for discussions on governance measures. It's an unfortunate feature, but I think the period in which we are witnessing all of these changes, that's the main reason. Take the case of the APRSF. There are 2 space cooperation mechanisms in the region. You have the APRSF under the leadership of the Japan, and you have the APSCO under China's leadership. These 2 bodies don't even cooperate, don't even have a mechanism to cooperate with each other. So that shows the divisive nature of the region in a sense of the Indo-Pacific. So how divisive, how competitive the 2 regions are. So the region has pretty much managed to divide themselves between these 2 groups in terms of some countries wanting to work with Japan and the APSRF leadership, and others wanting to work under the Chinese leadership through APSCO and so on and so forth. But how do you find even certain mechanisms, certain processes, certain institutional measures to bring about at least start having conversations, having some sort of a dialogue and kind of openness in terms of, then you can talk about that. The next step could be in terms of what you want to talk about. Is it governance that you want to talk about? At least can we get around to developing some sort of an agreement, consensus on what are the challenges that are driving countries in this region. But I think it's going to be really hard to come by. The US and India, what can they do? I think there's a lot that can happen. In fact, 2015, India started having a space security dialogue for the first time with the US. India recently, after that, I think for the second time, second such conversation India started with Japan, and now just a couple of days ago, India has now agreed to have similar space security conversations dialogue with France as well. So in a sense, space security conversations that are beginning to happen much more in a structured manner, that's happening. Second, there is also increasing Quad cooperation, for instance. Quad it's not so much done under the branding of the Quad itself right now, but I think, for instance, at least from an Indian perspective, when I look at it, India has strengthened collaboration. India has a long history of collaboration with the US. It went through a brief patch when we did not really collaborate or due to certain sanctions and so on and so forth. But that really picked up momentum back in the 2000s, and that's continuing very much. But India's collaborative mechanisms, work with Japan and Australia are also picking up greater momentum. And I think all of this, in some sense, could coalesce under a branding like a Quad in the future, or a Quad plus kind of a network, which will include countries like France, for instance. Other capable space powers could also become part of it. And I have argued in some of my writings that I think, given the kind of great power politics and the great power difficulties in building consensus on global governance measures or space security challenges, I think the middle powers, especially the middle powers that are capable both in terms of technology as well as financial wherewithal, they need to come together to build some sort of technology aided solutions that can then push to at a later date to the major powers, and that you can build this great power support at a later stage. But first and foremost, you have to bring together at least a group of middle space powers who are much more invested in finding certain technological solutions, at least in the first stage, in a sense. And I think that might be a good way to go about. Indonesia is a capable Southeast Asian space player, and I think Indonesia is a major player, a major power in the Indo-Pacific Southeast Asian region. I think how Indonesia is able to channel the rest of the region also to kind of to come together for these kind of agreements, play a major role as a middle space player. I think these are possibilities that need to be explored further.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajagopalan. So I think because of the time concern, we only have one more round of questions. I will read one questions for Professor Wood and one questions for Dr. Rajagopalan. So for Professor Wood, the question is from researcher here at LAPAN. For Professor Woods, it's from Pak Mardianis. What is your view on the applications of the principles of responsible behavior to issues of space debris in resolutions number 75/36, when it is associated with the principle of common responsibility but different liability for the issues of climate change in the Paris Agreement? What is the important point so that they do not use the same principle, because of the fact that both are the same global issues regarding the Earth and space environment? How do you think about the problem of funding it? That was the questions for you. And then the questions for Dr. Rajagopalan is also from our researcher at LAPAN. In your opinion, is there any possibility that Asia will become the new arena for a space war, given that the fact that the existing space competitions between India, China, Japan, and the other new emerging space faring countries like Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea? I hope that the question is clear, right? We can start with Dr. Rajagopalan and then with Professor Wood.
Sure, thank you. That's again a terrific question. And Asia is clearly seeing the growth of the space is becoming an important aspect of their lives. Like I said, like most developing countries around the world, but not just in Asia or in the Pacific region, but in Africa, Latin America, these countries are just beginning to appreciate what space can do to change the social and economic lives of these people and of their countries, in a sense. So there is a greater attention generally being given to space, but in Asia, I think there is also the added aspect of the military and security related concerns that are becoming an important driver for many of the space programs, whether it is Vietnam wanting to invest in ISR capabilities in a big way, launching their satellites through Japan and so on and so forth, or some other country wanting to Singapore developing certain capabilities and so on and so forth. So there are a great, but of course you also have the bigger space players, whether it is China, Japan, and India, and the kind of competitive dynamics that is at play. So how does this become? Unfortunately, it is all true. The space is a new big arena, but I think the military space aspects of Asia is what is kind of distinguishing itself from the is a distinction from the kind of space program, big space programs that you see in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, you are going to see outer space competition as one more arena where this the geopolitical conflicts, geopolitical competition, rivalry is going to play out. So it's an unfortunate feature, but that's the way it's going to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajagopalan. Professor Wood.
Wonderful. The question that was addressed to me brought together two key themes. The fact that we do have either treaty language or international agreements that highlight the responsibility of states to either directly take action or to monitor the action of entities within their jurisdiction with regard to both behavior in space and, of course, on Earth. Now, we should separate, of course, on one side, we have the treaty language identifying the role of states to address what happens with their entities that are under their flag in space, and is not fully defined what that means. Meaning we have, as we heard earlier, the idea of some ambiguities in the treaty language, but there are, of course, then related guidelines, such as the United Nations guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space to help us interpret what responsible behavior would look like. So that's, if we put the treaty together with the guidelines, and we can perhaps, have more consensus on what it looks like. On the side of agreements like the Paris Agreement, of course, then you have this level of agreement toward a certain outcome we're trying to achieve at the global scale. To put it simply, if we take a step back from the official versions of treaties versus agreements, we could just say that there is a commonality between the challenge we're facing with the waste, in a sense, the physical waste of objects that are orbiting around the Earth that are sometimes no longer useful pieces of machinery, but now are trash that can create risk. And in a similar sense, we've created a challenge over the last few hundred years of putting, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere, but also other emissions. And that has been a form of waste as well. And in both cases, there has not been an economic relationship in which there was a direct cost to the emitter, where whoever was operating a certain factory or a certain satellite debris generation activity didn't necessarily have to pay. And of course, there are some experiments with trying to directly either create a carbon tax or other forms of either incentives or penalties to show that there's an economic cost that should be, rather than being left to the whole world to pay, should be internalized to the economic activity. But we're at a key point, I would argue, not just in sort of what's happening on Earth, but also what's happening in space, to decide, do we have the appetite as policymakers, and then also do we have the coordination effort across countries to decide that when there are emissions of waste, whether it's in the form of greenhouse gases or in the form of physical objects in space, will we make an effort to manage that by requiring some payment? And one of the questions, part of the question that was addressed to me was asking, what are the methods to fund? It seems, of course, the problems are so large, it's really hard to directly sort of say, one particular group should pay X. But I think what we should think about is multifaceted approaches. For example, our space sustainability rating approach is voluntary, and it's done in a more private sector organization where we're asking companies to voluntarily self-regulate, where they should pay a little bit in terms of their design process, their operations process, to have the personnel and the technology to help reduce risk of creating space debris. So that's a cost they would take on, and their benefit is that they get a chance to claim a very positive rating and have hopefully better commercial opportunities. You could then also ask what role, for example, insurance companies would play in space launch insurance and operational insurance, or what role governments would play to reinforce that. Would governments perhaps choose to require a certain level of the space sustainability rating in order to give a launch license, which is a way to enforce, directly through a government relationship, a certain level of responsible behavior. We are proposing, we are very open as the space sustainability rating team. We'd love to talk to governments about this idea of incorporating some or all of the recommendations for sustainable behavior that are in our rating system, which are derived from other related documents as part of regulations, or it can be done as more an incentive process. So similarly with activities on Earth related to global climate change, there I think has to be a portfolio, somewhat of regulations, somewhat of government investment in cleaning up areas that are truly affecting the public, and also in self-regulation by companies where they also pay, in a sense, to address their own waste streams. You do see examples of companies that set ambitious goals, for example, reducing their physical waste, their water waste, their amount of creating waste that goes into landfills. Some of them are choosing to do so because they find it to be a positive way to build the reputation. So we hope that with a combination of private sector regulation, self-regulation, but also reinforced heavily by national regulation of the entities in the country, but also reinforced by international cooperation and diplomacy, we might have progress, but we have to decide to do it together. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Wood and Dr. Rajagopalan. Please join me in giving the big round of applause for both our distinguished speakers for all their insight and all their fruitful thoughts throughout the discussions. Before we end up these sessions, I would like to invite Dr. Ganewati Wuryandari, the head of Research Center for Area Studies at the Indonesian Institute for Science, for giving her closing remarks. Ibu Ganewati, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pak Aristia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. because I think we all have a different time zone. First of all, I would like to thank to the organizing committee LAPAN for this webinar series. It is very great webinar. It is my pleasure to be able to join to this pivotal webinar, especially with two prominent speakers. And it is very interesting during this discussion that two speakers were very different point of view in look at space diplomacy. Professor Wood, I think she underlined the use of space for peaceful, especially for the sustainability of development. On the other hand, with the current trend in Indo-Pacific, which space can no longer be seen as a purely peaceful domain, Professor Rajagopalan highlight our look the space diplomacy in terms of security aspect. With those two different perspectives, I think it is kind of reflection of the Indo-Pacific construction, which acknowledge the interconnectedness of strategic, economic, and social issues between the countries in Indo-Pacific. In Indonesia, I think we cannot put side on or choosing the aspect with the others. I think Indonesia space diplomacy in the longer future have to look on the two aspects. However, with knowing that Indonesia has a limitation, especially knowing that space diplomacy have high risk, high technology, and high cost, we have to look in the near and the middle future, the niche diplomacy for the space diplomacy. And the national interest of Indonesia on space diplomacy, I look at the three aspects, which is strengthening space technology, and then using space diplomacy for achieving Indonesia in diplomatic priority, and then using space diplomacy for increasing national independence, especially to protect national unity. So I think Indonesia have to choose in the near and the future about the space diplomacy, because we have a limitation. So we can be able to tackle on the space diplomacy, which might comprise the state governance, this deep risk, like the speaker have already also underlined, and also about science, space diplomacy, and so on. So I learned a lot about this discussion, and thank you for those speakers. I think before I close this evening webinar, we have to think that in terms of space diplomacy with Indonesian limitation and Indonesia as a middle power, is it possible that Indonesia can play a role in space diplomacy and in Pacific? Even Professor Rajagopalan underlined about the very competitive space governance in Indo-Pacific. So whether any space for Indonesia as middle power to enhance its role in the space diplomacy, especially to establish space governance in Indo-Pacific. Yeah, I think that's all that I would like to say. Thank you again. I'm very grateful for LAPAN for this tremendous support for the research, and also tremendous support for this seminar as a host, and also to the webinar organizing committee, particularly Ibu Yunita. So thank you very much for your participation, and I do hope that you are all stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ibu Ganewati, for the closing remarks. I won't give any conclusions on these panels. I think we all agree that we learned a lot of things, and I think the speakers give a tremendous insight for our research and also for the Indonesian government to formulate the Indonesian's diplomacy going forward. So again, please joining me to give a biggest round of applause to our panelists. I'm sure if this would be an offline seminar, would be a lot of crowd of applause. Thank you very much, Professor Wood, and thank you very much, Dr. Rajagopalan. And Pak Andre, we're looking forward to receive your invitations to visit Houston, Pak. So thank you very much, everyone. Stay healthy and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Morning.
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Thank you, Dr. Raji.
Terima kasih Pak Andre.
Terima kasih Pak Andre.
Dr.
Thank you,
Rajagopalan.
Thank you,
Profesor
Dr.
Wood.
Rajagopalan.
Ibu
Thank you so
Gane,
much.
terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih Pak.
Thank you.